So we wanted to think about a new way of presenting repertoire that some of you might already be familiar with. So we've decided to kind of alter the order of this evening's performance. We first got this idea when we started thinking about the programming for the Clark, where we performed just a few weeks ago. And just as gallerists and directors and curators at museums think of the way in which they present works of visual art, it's incredibly important in programming musical performances to think about how different works of music play off of one another. Because the way in which you hear one work can be very much affected by the other pieces that you've heard before it and after it. So we decided to kind of think about this program in a new way. We are going to perform this evening the entirety of the Dvorak American Quartet, the American String Quartet. However, we're going to be playing the first two movements at the start of the program. After that, you're going to hear the first movement of Elliott Carter, the American composer's Woodwind Quintet. Then we're going to play a transcription of Charles Ives' the Concord Piano Sonata. Then we're going to play, sort of like a palindrome, we're going to play then the second movement of the Elliott Carter. And then we're going to finish up with the final two movements of Dvorak. So our goal in programming this is that by the time you hear the final two movements of the Dvorak, that you've been influenced, that your ear has been somehow altered by what you've heard in the other works. And there's another side to this program. As we began to think about which pieces to play together, as it began to evolve and take shape, we realized that all of these works are in some way reflections of America, the place, yet in unique ways. So the Dvorak American Quartet is, of course, written from the perspective of a Bohemian transplant who had come to New York City and later to Iowa, and was enraptured with the folk music that he heard here. So he had this very unique outsider's perspective on the American musical tradition. Elliott Carter was, of course, an American, and yet his Woodwind Quintet was inspired by his work with Nadia Boulanger in Paris. So you have this sort of composer who was sort of part of that lost generation of artists who found themselves in Paris and were thinking about the American experience almost as a memory. Then you have Charles Ives, who is, of course, a quintessentially American composer. And his work is very much reflective of particularly New England and of the spirit that he experienced in his life and in his community. So as we perform this program, I'll give you a little bit of commentary, things to listen for, ways of hearing the music. But without further ado, we'll now play the second movement of the Dvorak String Quartet, arranged for that lone clarinet at the end is sort of like perhaps the last little line of calligraphy tracing off from something that has been written, just sort of fades. And now perhaps allow that somber sound, that warm, quiet sound to fade into the transcription that we're about to play of Charles Ives' Concord Sonata. This is his second piano sonata. We're going to play for you a transcription that Isabel, our flutist, prepared of the Alcott's movement. So Charles Ives, in addition to being one of the great American musical artists and one of the sort of most important early avant-gardists, actually, in many ways. He was also a keen observer of the sounds that surrounded him. And he liked to take fragments of his surroundings and incorporate those into his music. So the entirety of the Concord Sonata is sort of inspired by what he had experienced in his idyllic New England life. And it also incorporates elements of perhaps some band tunes that he had heard in a band shell, some old hymns that he might have heard as a church organist in his youth. And in particular, in the Alcotts, you'll hear almost phantom-like fragments of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But they're presented almost as this distant memory. They just sort of find their way into the texture. So as you listen to this movement, just imagine perhaps someone sitting at the piano, thinking about things that he perhaps heard on the Victrola. Perhaps he had a great recording of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. Just little memories that begin to infect this piece of music. Antonín Dvořák is, of course, a Czech composer who spent a great deal of time here in the United States. He actually came over with his family to New York City and spent quite a long time here, and I believe the home in which he lived was not far from here, on the east side. I don't believe that the building is there any longer, but there seems, I think there's a plaque there designating where he had lived. He also spent some time in, of all places, a small community in Iowa called Spillsville, and this was sort of a Czech enclave. And he and his family spent quite a long time there. And it must have been such an interesting experience for him to be in this very new place and yet be surrounded by fragments of the culture of his home. So he had reminders, the folk songs, the music was there, the food was there, the language was there, and yet he was in a very new place. So the American String Quartet is kind of written from the perspective of someone who is synthesizing new experiences with memories that he had brought with him from his former home. It's certainly got elements of folk music, but what's interesting is that there are elements of folk music both from the United States and from Czechoslovakia or Bohemia, where he was from. So it's really a perfect melting pot of a work of music. And we hope you enjoy the third and final movements of the American String Quartet, number 12, by Antonín Dvořák. Beethoven might not be as much of a ghost in some places. It's actually quite present. I mean, it's pretty obvious at times what he was quoting there. And that's quite common for many composers to insert familiar tunes, or at least a familiar spirit. So in the second movement of Elliott Carter's Woodwind Quintet, the spirit that he is trying to capture is the lively jazz age. So he, of course, was living in New York, then studied in Paris, where jazz was still very much a hot thing. And even in this very dense and very, at times, almost chaotic movement, you can still hear a sense of the jazz inflections within the rhythms. You can hear a few blue notes inserted here and there, and you'll hear generally a lively spirit that he no doubt encountered in countless clubs and found a way to place within his music. So now the second movement of Elliott Carter's Woodwind Quintet. The Woodwind Quintet of Elliott Carter.
I think
You don't know.
Our guest at the Clark, of course. So it's clearly a rarity in performance in many situations. Many woodwind quintets even tend to not perform it because they believe, oh, it doesn't have the flashiness, say, of some other more vibrant works. However, I think we would all agree it's exceptionally flashy. And so, in contrast to what you heard in the Dvořák, the Carter exudes a feeling of excitement, the sort of hustle bustle of city life. I had an audience member one time tell us that she could feel that she was getting off the train at Times Square, walking around at night, listening to various textures of sounds. And then at the end, she just collapsed in her chair at home after having taken in all of that. So it's a work with great density, And sometimes it can be difficult to know exactly what to listen to. And I felt that way when I first heard the piece. I was like, I don't really get it. But then I started to think about the work in the same way that I think about looking at static paintings and realizing that there's actually a lot of motion that can exist in something that's even sitting still, and a lot of texture and dynamism that can exist in something that's still. So perhaps an interesting way to listen to this piece is at any given moment, just try to hear it three-dimensionally. Even if you're just encountering the surface of the sound, try to hear what's perhaps lurking behind. So without further ado, Elliott Carter's Woodwind Quintet from 1948, the first movement.